Hello, this is Christopher from Defeat Modernism, and welcome to part 2 of my series, Liberty of Perdition, the Founding of the United States of America. For those of you who are coming across this for the first time, I do suggest watching part 1. I'll put a link to that in the description box. And as a reminder, I'll be drawing much of the information in this video series from a textbook entitled United States History, A Traditional Catholic Perspective from Christ the King Books. I will put a link where you can buy the book. This covers all of United States history beginning with Columbus, and it is all from a traditional Catholic perspective without the lies and deception of the Judeo-Masonic education system, press, or Hollywood. So a lot of you will find this, I think, very refreshing, and you'll learn a lot of things that you probably were never taught in school for obvious reasons. So in part 1, we had covered the Founding Fathers and their revolutionary, their Masonic ideas. And part of those ideas was an anti-Catholic and anti-monarchy point of view. Most of you in the United States will know that the Revolutionary War, the main reason that was given was the taxation. But there was a reason why England had wanted to tax the colonies and needed to tax the colonies. And that main reason is the French and Indian War. So that made Britain the largest empire in the world, but it also had a big bill to pay. At that time, 70 million British pounds of debt that they had to pay because of that conflict. But it wasn't just that war with France that led them into so much debt. From the beginning of the founding of the colonies, the British Navy was there protecting the colonies from their enemies, from their foes. And the British government had to pay bounties to the shipbuilders for their work. Also, during this time, the colonial tobacco growers had a monopoly on the market to England. So those were some of the reasons why the English needed to tax the colonies to help pay for all of this. And contrast that with today, when our tax dollars are just literally being spent like drunken sailors to give money to Ukraine, to give money to Israel, to give money to all these countries that don't have our best interests in mind, that we should have no dealings with in foreign affairs. And we shouldn't be involved in their own foreign wars that have no impact on our shores here. And that's why we are in so much debt, and why the nation itself is on the verge of collapse, economically and obviously morally. So the colonists were not paying any taxes, and the British government had then demanded them to pay their fair share of the expenses that the crown had incurred in fighting the French and defending the colonies from their enemies. And the taxes that they paid were pennies compared to the taxes that we pay today in this country. It's crazy, the amount of taxes that come out of the paycheck, and to go to what? For what benefit does it really give us? And really, the money goes overseas, and it's just going into the most corrupt, most immoral, godless organizations. The public schools come to mind as one of the big beneficiaries of the property taxes and all the taxes that we have to pay to these immoral oligarchs that run this country. In the colonies, it was the oligarchs that were the first to raise their voices in protest against the British government. And this would be with the Sugar Act. The Founding Fathers, many of which were part of the oligarchy, not all of them, but the oligarchy was the more educated, the richer, the more popular people who took part in the colonial assemblies. Now, this is a quote from Gary Potter on this period of time. He says, quote, "It is a myth that revolutions take place when the oppressed masses, supposedly, heroically rise up and strike off their chains. That lie is nothing but the product of 2 centuries of revolutionary propaganda. In truth, revolutions happen when a ruling class stops believing in its right to rule. It was the case in France in the 18th century, when the king's own cousin, the debauched Duc de Lyon, insisted on being addressed as a citizen, quote unquote, and cast the decisive vote in the convention for the king's execution. It was again the case in Russia in 1917, when the Masonic lodges of St. Petersburg and Moscow were full of nobles. And just remember that in 1917, that was when the Russian Jewish Bolshevik communists revolted, and then this ended in the monarchy of Russia with the Tsar and his royal family being ritually murdered, and then ushering in communism, which would then mass murder, I believe it's somewhere around 60 million people, mainly white Orthodox Christians and Catholics. And just as a reminder, it was in 1917 when Our Lady appeared at Fatima in Portugal, warning mankind of what was about to take place with Russia spreading her errors throughout the world. Speaking of the end of World War I and the coming of World War II. And here we are today with the culmination of the errors of Russia, meaning the errors of the Enlightenment, the errors of the Protestant Reformation, the errors of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And this era of liberty was very dominant in the United States during this period of history. They had a very Puritan mentality, and they wanted unrestrained freedom, hated the monarchy, and the oligarchs, the semi or quasi aristocrats of that time, were just looking for an opportunity to revolt against the monarch. When this occurred, this opportunity came in 1764. The British government passed an act taxing the import of foreign sugar to the colonies. There was many complaints from merchants in the colonies, and as a result of that, James Otis, who was a wealthy lawyer, he stood up and basically said that the colonies were not represented in the British Parliament, and therefore England had no right to tax them. And it was true. They did not have representation in Parliament. And that's where that slogan that you've heard of no taxation without representation. And frankly, what good is representation now? I'd rather not have any representation and not be taxed than have these representatives be taxed 30, 40, 50% of your money. But what ended up happening really is that the same colonists, these oligarchs who were protesting against the British taxation, themselves didn't allow full representation of the colonists under their own authority, and then tax them. So what was the point other than them gaining power and money, which is usually what wars are fought about anyway? It's always power and money. Next, we go to the Stamp Act, and this would happen the following year, so 1765. And it was yet another attempt by the British to gain some income from the colonies to help pay off those debts. So the Stamp Act was directed that all paper, legal cards, and pamphlets must have a stamp indicating the payment of a small tax in order for them to be sold. Once this came about, Patrick Henry, he rose up in the Virginia State House and defied this law, this British right to taxation. Then in October of 1765, Congress was convened, and then delegates from the various colonies met on how to stop this. Virginia and Georgia's governors refused to send delegates to this Congress. That assembly drew up what was called the Declaration of Rights and Liberties, and they demanded an exemption from the taxation from the British Parliament. And again, it was the same argument, no taxation without representation, but the British Parliament refused to debate them in any way regarding this. From here, you have the birth of the quote-unquote Sons of Liberty under the direction of Samuel Adams. So these were the radicals. These were the rebels of the time Maybe you can think of them as the Antifa of today. So they started riots in Boston. They were looting, setting fires to the tax collectors' houses, as well as to the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson. So they were the Minutemen. They were ready at any moment to punish anyone they saw fit. So again, it's echoes of today with the Supreme Court decisions and all these radicals just rampaging like violent little children because they haven't gotten their way. So the merchants of the rebellion, they made a compact among themselves that they would only sell colonial goods or those smuggled from France, Spain, or the Dutch. And it was this illegal smuggling was another main reason why they refused the Stamp Act, because they were getting these smuggled goods prior to the Stamp Act and selling it, but now they wouldn't be able to make money off of that illicit merchandise because they didn't have that British stamp. And then the same merchants were forcing the common folk to join them, kind of like a mafia tactic, to join that revolution, that revolutionary spirit, by punishing anyone who was loyal to Britain and who actually bought articles with the Stamp Act on it. So again, it's just peer pressure on people who wanted to do what was right. They wanted to give to Caesar what belonged to Caesar, as I quoted in the beginning of this video from our Lord's words. But the merchants' boycott and then the complaints of the British merchants and manufacturers who were left without any income because of this rebellion, the British Parliament then ended the act in 1766. They repealed it. But they did make known to the colonies that the Parliament had authority over them in all cases whatsoever. Now, this next quote is taken from Today in Masonic History. And it says regarding the Sons of Liberty, quote, "The Sons of Liberty in Boston was largely made of Freemasons from the area. Although it was not a Masonic organization and did not have an exclusive Masonic membership, many of the leaders of the organization were Freemasons. A Masonic legend holds that the night of the Boston Tea Party, St. Andrew's Lodge of Boston, which owned the Green Dragon Tavern, meeting place of both the Lodge and the Sons of Liberty, had their regular meeting that night. In the minutes of the meeting, it allegedly stated that the Masonic meeting was canceled due to lack of quorum, enough members present, presumably because all the members were off dumping tea in the Boston harbor." And here you can see on the screen, this was an old watercolor sketch of the original Green Dragon Tavern in Boston. In the upper left-hand corner, the infamous Masonic symbol, the compass and square. And then on the bottom, the inscription reads, quote, "Where we met to plan the consignment of a few shiploads of tea," end quote. That building is now torn down. There's another tavern built there in its place. But this is just showing the satanic, the Luciferian spirit behind revolution, behind the American Revolution, and the players who played the biggest roles in the rebellion against the crown and in the foundation of the country. Now we will move into the Townshend Act. And at this point, the colonists thought that that was it for the British taxes. But in 1767, the Townshend Act, which was to raise taxes on paint, paper, lead, and tea, was put in place to raise money to go to the salaries of the royal governors in the colonies. Of course, you have the Sons of Liberty stirring up riots in New England, and then the state of New York refused to allow any British ships into its harbor. Merchants would then again boycott British goods, and then you have Samuel Adams in Massachusetts encouraging the colonies to resist the tax. The royal governor of Massachusetts, Francis Bernard, he goes back home to England disgusted, And then these rebellious oligarchs set up their new assemblies. And then you have Hutchinson, the governor of Boston. When he left, he wrote, quote, "At first, indeed, the supreme authority of the crown seemed to be admitted, the cases of taxes only accepted, but the exceptions gradually extended from one case to another, until it included all cases whatever. A profession of quote-unquote subordination, however, still remained. It was a word without any precise meaning to it," end quote. So what does he mean by that quote? Basically, slowly, the obedience and submission of the colonists was diminishing until finally they came to the realization and decided, without any officially saying it, that England had no right to rule its colonies. So again, it's a spirit of rebellion. I shall not serve. I will not serve, the rebellion of Lucifer. In 1772, you have Samuel Adams organizing the committees of correspondence. This would allow the colonies to stay in communication with each other on developments of what was going on. And then this would end up becoming a governmental agency for the colonists and would replace more or less the prior assemblies. By the time that the Townshend Act had been repealed in 1770, there was an unrelated civil war, which was on a smaller scale, being developed in the Carolina colonies, and it was over this same problem of taxation. The irony of it is that the oligarchies, the colonists, the oligarchs of those colonies, had such greed that they put excessive taxes on the commoners, the common folk there. And they in turn took up their pitchforks and guns and went to the capital and called themselves the quote-unquote regulators. There was only one open battle. It was on May 16th, and they were defeated. So here you have these oligarchs complaining to the British about taxes, and then they go in turn and put even higher taxes on the people in their own colonies. And now this brings us to the HMS Gaspee, 1772. So Rhode Island was infamous for smuggling, and England wanted to abolish this illegal activity because they wanted to enforce the necessary customs on the merchandise coming in. So Lieutenant Duddingston was sent from England on the ship HMS Gaspee to Rhode Island. And he was chasing a colonial merchant ship and ran aground. And then, of course, the Sons of Liberty were there. They rowed out to the ship and they put it on fire, and then firing at the lieutenant. And so the ship was destroyed. You can see a rendition of it in this painting on the screen. And this was not the first time that a British ship was destroyed by the rebels. In previous years, you had the HMS St. John and HMS Liberty also had suffered similar fates. In 1773, you have the British Parliament passing the Tea Act in order to rescue the British East India Company that was in financial straits at that time. And this would allow the company to export tea to the American colonies without paying tax to Britain. So because of this, the British East India Company was able to sell its tea for a cheaper price in the colonies than the price which the colonial oligarchs sold their own smuggled tea for. So at that time, the merchants were smuggling in about 900,000 pounds of tea per year. So you can see there's this illegal smuggling of tea, and they want their money. You know, again, it always comes down to money and power. So obviously the colonists refused to put up with the monopoly of the British East India Company for tea, and they wouldn't pay the tea tax either. So the Massachusetts governor, Hutchinson, who we just heard from, was in opposition to these rebels, and he prevented ships from leaving, despite the threats from the Sons of Liberty. But these Sons of Liberty on December 16th, 1773, dressed up disguised as Indians, boarded the ships, and then dumped that tea. about $75,000 worth into the sea. So this is the famous Boston Tea Party. Britain then sends a fleet and a couple of regiments led by General Gage into Boston because of the open rebellion that was taking place there. The British fleet would then seize a ship owned by John Hancock entitled the Liberty, and it was seized on the grounds that it had been used in illegal smuggling. Then this just increases the tensions, and the citizens of Boston gather around a sentry named Preston and then his men, throwing stones and snowballs and taunting them. And then one soldier was hit by a swinging cudgel, and then he fired at the crowd. Others then fired in the confusion. 3 civilians were killed. Others then would later die of wounds. Of course, the Sons of Liberty, they exaggerate the incident by calling it the quote-unquote Boston Massacre. But it was actually John Adams who, to his honor, he defended the soldiers in a trial, saying that they had a right to defend themselves and defend their lives against this mob. This would then lead to Parliament punishing the colonies even more with the Quebec Act, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Prime Minister Lord North, who was arguing against the Whigs, who were opposed to any punishment of the colonies, said the following, quote, "The Americans have tarred and feathered your subjects, plundered your merchants, burnt your ships, denied all obedience to your laws and authority. Yet so clement and so long forbearing has our conduct been, that it is incumbent on us now to take a different course. Whatever may be the consequences, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over." So some of these punishments were the port of Boston being closed until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea. This put a lot of people out of work and caused issues with food. The members of the Massachusetts House of Representatives could only be appointed by the king. They could only meet once a year. The colonists were obliged to host British soldiers in their private homes, and they could be tried in any colony or in England. In addition to that, the Parliament passed the Quebec Act, and this would end up extending the borders of Quebec and included lands in which the colonies had formerly claimed, in particular the Ohio Valley. But what really worried the colonists was that this new act allowed the freedom of worship to French and English Catholics. The Test Act was also abolished at this time, and this would mean that Catholics could hold seats in government now. And then, to make even matters worse for the anti-Catholic, anti-Christ colonists, the Jesuits were allowed to return, and the Catholic Church could collect tithes. So you could imagine the uproar of these faithless colonists and Masons and people who just absolutely hated Christ as king and hated the church. So most of the colonies would then agree with a Richard H. Lee that these acts were, quote, "a most wicked system for destroying the liberty of all America," end quote. So the 13 colonies, except for Georgia, would send delegates to Philadelphia, where on September 5th, 1774, you'd have the First Continental Congress. The conservative forces wanted to work out a compromise with Parliament, but the radicals, which were led by John Adams, wanted an altogether new system of government independent of Britain. They would then pass the Suffolk Resolves, which declared the Intolerable Acts contrary to British law, and they encouraged the taking up of arms for protection. What they ended up deciding was that all British goods would be boycotted, and any offenders of the boycott would be liable to punishment. So here you have the colonists threatening to punish anyone who broke their laws, these are laws they had no right to make to begin with. And then these same laws were contrary to the laws of the rightful rulers, England. And that brings me to Pope Gregory the 16th, And his encyclical on civil obedience, this was written June 9th, 1832. And this follows the consistent traditional teaching of the church, going back to St. Paul, St. Peter, obviously our Lord, and saying, give to Caesar, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. But Gregory XVI here says, watch earnestly, lest deceitful men and the promoters of novelties continue to spread erroneous doctrines and false dogmas in your flock. Using the pretext of the common good, as is their custom, they take advantage of the credulity of those who are naive and rash, so that they may have them as blind servants and supporters in disturbing the peace of the kingdom and in overturning the order of society. Surely, the fraud of these would-be teachers must be uncovered in clear words for the good and the instruction of the faithful. The fallacy of their thought must be refuted courageously everywhere with the words of divine scripture and the testimony of church tradition. From these most pure fountains, from which the Catholic clergy ought to draw the plan of their lives and the material for their sermons to the people, we are taught most clearly that the obedience which men are obliged to render to the authorities established by God is an absolute precept which no one can violate, except if by chance something is commanded which runs counter to the laws of God or the Church. Let everyone, says the Apostle, be subject to higher authorities, for there exists no authority except from God, and those who exist have been appointed by God. Therefore, he who resists the authority resists the ordination of God. Wherefore, you must needs be subject not only because of the wrath, but also for conscience' sake. And that's from Romans chapter 13, verses 1, 2, and 5. Similarly, St. Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13, teaches all the faithful, be subject to every human creature for God's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to the governors sent through him. For he says, such is the will of God, that by doing good you would silence the ignorance of foolish men. By observing these admonitions, the first Christians, even during the persecutions, deserved well of the Roman emperors themselves and of the security of the state. Christian soldiers, says St. Augustine, served an infidel emperor. When it came to the subject of Christ, they recognized no one except him who was in heaven. They distinguished between the eternal Lord and the temporal Lord, but also were subject to the temporal Lord because the eternal Lord. And that is from St. Augustine on Psalm 124. And these anti-Catholic, anti-Christ colonists, founders of the United States, would attack the proclamation line of 1763, which afforded protection to Catholics. There was one rebel, John Jay, and he criticized Parliament that it, quote, should ever consent to establish in that country, he was talking of Canada, a religion, and there he's speaking of Catholicism, that has deluged your island in blood and disturbed impiety, bigotry, persecution, murder, and rebellion through every part of the world, end quote. And he was a so-called conservative, but he didn't mince his words there. He denounced Catholicism in total. The Congress here took up officially this position. Quote, the late Act of Parliament for establishing the Roman Catholic religion and the French laws in that extensive country, now called Quebec, is dangerous in an extreme degree to the Protestant religion and to the civil rights and liberties of all America, and therefore, as men and Christians, we are indispensably obliged to take all proper measures for our security, end quote. So this particular Congress was the first time that the colonies worked together as a unit, but many people doubted the legitimacy of it. Did they really have any authority to legislate? Especially given that only a third of the common folks even supported the Congress, even supported the rebellion. A third were indifferent to them, and then the other third supported the king. So they didn't even have a majority of the people backing their rebellious cause. So how could it even be justified? It couldn't. Obviously, through Catholic doctrine, the rebellion was illegitimate. And the rebellion is based on Masonic principles, which they claim to be Christians, but they're not Christians. You really can't truthfully call Protestant Christians because they don't have the faith. They don't believe in the Christian faith that Christ taught. So what's interesting during this period, you had a Father John Carroll, who was more or less a liberal. He would fit right in today, probably, with the false, phony Catholic, quote-unquote, Novus Ordo priests. But Father John Carroll was sympathetic to the rebels, and he was a priest in the colonies. He was a good friend, of course, of Freemason Benjamin Franklin. And at the request of the Continental Congress, they both went together to Quebec to try to get support from the Canadians for the rebellion. But they didn't gain any support. They met only with a resistance and what we would say a no-nonsense Catholic response to the papal teachings. So Bishop Briand of Quebec, he shared the Tories' doubts about the legitimacy of a revolt against the English king, and he strictly forbade his priests to provide lodging to either Father Carroll or Benjamin Franklin, and he even excommunicated Father Carroll for his rebellion against King George III's authority. So how do you like that? That's a true Catholic bishop doing what was right, what was in with Catholic tradition and the teaching of the church. And now this sets the stage for the war, because neither the king with Parliament nor the colonies would concede to the other. But the British Whigs, from their point of view, they felt that if the king could succeed in curbing the power of these oligarchs in the colonies, he could do the same back home in England and thus become a tyrant, or at least what they viewed as a tyrant. So you had the British conservatives with the king on the one hand, under attack by the Whigs in the home government, as well as from the rebel Whigs in the colonies. The Tories were the loyalists, loyal to the British king, to the crown. And they had several reasons why they wanted to remain faithful to the crown. They didn't see or view slightly higher taxes as a grave enough reason to revolt. And by revolting, that means breaking their oath that they swore to the king. And the king was the principle, the foundation, the cause of the order, to whom they could appeal in the case of oppression by an oligarchy of colonists, which, as we learned just prior, they were putting even worse taxes on colonists in the Carolinas. There was always a very good supply of British troops that could be sent to the colonies to protect them, and the king had a treasury to draw from. The British also were able to effectively employ the Indians to stir them up in guerrilla warfare against the rebels. But there was difficulties too on the British side of the war, because they really had very little or no organization, the loyalists that is, prior to the war. And because of this, because of the colonial oligarchy's power and influence, many would-be loyalists before the war found themselves outside the oligarch clique. And this was the case for the royal governors. So they had few forces of their own during the war. And of course, there's a great distance between England and the United States, with the ocean there, and the vessels were not as they were today, obviously, as far as being able to traverse the water in a quick period of time. But where did Catholics find themselves in this war? The poorer Catholics were more or less sympathetic to the loyalist side, and they had been loyal to the British, for many decades. Major Henry Clinton, he was a British Catholic who served King George III, and Father John McKenna was the first priest since the Protestant revolt to serve in the British Army. Now, for the rebels, there was obviously a solid group of radicals who were anti-monarchists, anti-Catholic, of course, and wanted independence from the crown. These would be the colonial equivalents to the Whigs in the English Parliament. Freemasons, of course, were exceptionally numerous in this atmosphere, but in most conflicts, they were found on each side of the conflict. About a fourth of those in the Continental Congress were Freemasons. Other colonists joined the rebels in order to stop what they thought was unjust taxation, but didn't necessarily want outright independence from Britain. And then, of course, there was mass mobs that would be stirred up against just about anything with some incentive, like we see today in our day. But the wealthier Catholics in influential positions followed their wealthy rebel friends. So among these Catholics would be Charles Carroll of Carrollton. He was one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, and he was an admirer of the Enlightenment ideas. His cousin, Father Carroll, who we just spoke about, the one who was excommunicated by the Bishop of Quebec, he would later become the first bishop in the United States. And isn't that convenient? And of course, on the rebel side, you had leaders like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, who helped them greatly in diplomacy and in battle. And then you had the French nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette, and with France then joining the war against Britain. The rebels had few resources, and they did not have a strong currency. And again, a third of the population was indifferent to the cause. For them, they were going to pay taxes whether England won or whether the colonist oligarchs won. And then you had the Quakers and the like, who are pacifists, who just believe that the war is unjustifiable and they wouldn't join either side. So that this now sets up for the actual war itself. And then you would have the First Continental Congress, and this is where the Minutemen, the famous Minutemen, were ordered, armed, and mobilized. General Gage, who was a royal governor, he saw this, and then in April of 1775, he gave orders to have John Hancock and Samuel Adams arrested in Lexington, and then also ordered their ammunition stores in Concord to be destroyed. The Sons of Liberty, their spy system, would find out about it, and then they would have that ammunition moved to a more secure location. Now, two of the more famous rebels, Paul Revere and William Dawes, were both Freemasons, with Paul Revere being the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. And as many of you probably know, they both rode through the night, warning the nearby countryside of the arrival of the British. And then the next morning, when the British infantry marched toward Lexington, there were 700 American soldiers under the command of Captain Parker awaiting them. The British commander, Colonel Pitcairn, he said to them, "Lay down your arms," and of course they did not. And the rest is history, as they say. That would be the start of the American Revolutionary War. Now, I'm not going to go over all the battles and things that were going on specifically here. It's really not the purpose of this video. It's more to focus on the errors of the founders of the United States and of those who were supporting them. One thing I will mention, though, is that in Albany, during the war, there was a Sir John Johnson. He was a Tory and a royal agent for Indian affairs. He was surrounded by the rebel forces. They gave him a chance to surrender, but he refused because he had taken an oath previously never to fight the king. The rebels forced Sir John and the Scottish Catholic tenants of that area, together with their priest, Father John McKenna, to march up to Montreal during the winter. And of course, on the journey, women and children died from the cold and the starvation. Now, in the beginning of the war, most Americans still nominally admitted the authority of King George. They just thought that the fighting was with his ministers in Parliament. So there was not a real idea of independence from Britain at this point, but it was gaining ground. And then you have Thomas Paine, who was a mechanic and farmer. He decided to write his essay titled Common Sense. And in that essay, he advocates for complete independence from Britain, and he calls the king the quote-unquote royal brute. So this is the same type of spirit in this letter, in this essay, Common Sense, that we see from what we learned in the first part. Another arrogant hater of religion. He said, quote, "I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish church, by the Roman church, by the Greek church, by the Turkish church, by the Protestant church, nor by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church," end quote. As if his darkened mind has any understanding of truth, which obviously it does not. But let's listen to another quote of his and get more into that mind, that dark mind. Here he says, quote, "Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. But there is another and greater distinction for which no truly natural or religious reason can be assigned, and that is the distinction of men into kings and subjects. O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyrant, but the tyrant stand forth. Every spot of the old world," and here he means Catholic Europe and Anglican England, "is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. O receive the fugitive, and prepare in time an asylum for mankind," end quote. So you hear him claim that government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. So that's a serious error right there, where you'll hear repeated over and over again by these founding fathers. And he's just speaking simply of government in general, as if anarchy is going to be a better option. But this is condemned by right reason, and also by the Catholic Church and by solid philosophers like Aristotle. But if you look at St. Thomas Aquinas' work on kingship, he combines Aristotle's wisdom with sacred scripture. And we know that heaven is a kingdom, and that we pray each day when we pray the Our Father, "Thy kingdom come, and may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So monarchy would be the highest form of government, and what these gentlemen want, from what it appears from their writing, is a type of anarchy, which is just chaos, obviously diabolic. Who wants to live in chaos except men who have no faith and no morals? Now, many popes state the opposite of what Thomas Paine has said. And Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical letter Immortali Dei, has a great quote against this false teaching of Thomas Paine. And he said the following, quote, "It is not difficult to determine what would be the form and character of the state were it governed according to the principles of Christian philosophy. Man's natural instinct moves him to live in society, for he cannot, if dwelling apart, provide himself with the necessary requirements of life, nor procure the means of developing his mental and moral faculties. Hence, it is divinely ordained that he should lead his life, be it family or civil, with his fellow men, amongst whom alone his several wants can be adequately supplied. But, as no society can hold together, unless some one be over all, directing all to strive earnestly for the common good, every body politic must have a ruling authority, and this authority, no less than society itself, has its source in nature, and has, consequently, God for its author. Hence, it follows that all public power must proceed from God. For God alone is the true and supreme Lord of the world. Everything, without exception, must be subject to him and must serve him, so that whosoever holds the right to govern holds it from one sole and single source, namely God, the sovereign ruler of all. There is no power but from God." End quote. So there are the words of a man truly enlightened. That's true enlightenment, holy wisdom from on high. Everything he says is making perfect sense, and as we have lived our lives, it's clear to see that every society, every family, every group needs a leader to be able to stay together. And yet what we've seen from the cultural Marxists over the past century plus is they've been consistently trying to destroy the family, destroy the nation state, destroy monarchy, destroy everything that is a resemblance of God, of the divine monarchy, of divine fatherhood. And the result has been the chaos that we've been seeing build more and more and more over time. And now we're coming to what seems to be a head with the absolute absurdity of what's being taught in the schools and to the military, and all sorts of perversions, all sorts of upside down satanic world. And that is what happens when you destroy the truth, when you destroy true leadership and the foundations of society. Because the whole purpose of the society that God has given us is to lead to our salvation. And the leaders of the society, it's their responsibility to see to it that their subjects have every opportunity to make their way to heaven and to make the culture, the kingdom, the country, the state, whatever you want to call it, ordered toward the proper end. And that proper end is salvation. And how great would the world be if these men, these wicked men, if they used all this energy, all the money, all the time, all the power that they had for good instead of for evil? What a great world it would be. They would be truly seen as heroes, as leaders. But unfortunately, we have the exact opposite. And they used what they've been given for nefarious purposes. And here we have the situation that we're in. Then you also have Thomas Paine talking about some sort of invention of men, that being rulers and subjects. It's obvious there's always going to be some chain of command. There is a hierarchy in nature as well as in our own human nature and our human society. It's obvious. We're all not created equal. Some people are smarter than others. Some people are stronger than others, taller, some shorter. There's so many distinctions, so many different pros and cons that each person has, and every individual has something to contribute to society. Not everyone is meant to be a leader. Not everyone wants to be a leader. And that's just natural. Now, unfortunately, Thomas Paine is treated as some sort of hero or wise man. But it's because people don't understand Catholic teaching. They don't understand how society is rightly ordered. And it's been such a long period of time of men's thinking being corrupted by these false principles of Freemasonry, by the so-called Enlightenment, that when people hear something like Leo XIII stated, that government is good, they think, no way. But that's because we're so used to these horrible abuses at the hands of primarily Freemasonic presidents, Freemasonic and atheistic governors, mayors, prime ministers, you name it. Look at the governments of the world over the past 100 years after the Freemasons killed all the monarchs or compromised them. And what do? We have this so-called democracy. And what is that? you get to vote for two people who are of more or less the same party, because nothing ever changes for the better with these men in office, because they don't care about you. They don't even believe in God, so why would they give any type of care for you and your family and your needs? They do not care. They only care about their own power, their prestige, their money. And that's been evident for a very, very long time. Now, what's interesting to note is George Washington was not that big on independence. He had said, quote, "I am well satisfied as I can be of my existence, that no such thing is desired by any thinking man in North America," end quote. But the problem was conservatives like Washington, the loyalists, they were looking at being culpable of treason. They could have been hanged or imprisoned. So many people at that point just went with the rebellion. And then the loyalists to the crown were forced to flee back to England, or they were just driven out completely. At this point, most of the colonies endorsed independence, with the exception of New York and Pennsylvania. One of the biggest, I guess you could say, errors of the British was that they didn't organize and use the thousands of loyalists that were already in the colonies. That would have been a huge help to them. But instead, they hired, I guess you could say, mercenaries, Hessians from the German state of Hesse-Kassel. So they, along with the Catholic Irish, who were loyal to the king, came on their own accord and fought for the British crown here in America. And a standout battle during the Revolutionary War would be the Battle of Long Island, which was the largest during the whole campaign. And that's where the Americans suffered their first defeat. But you had General Howe for England. He was a staunch Whig in Parliament, which, if you remember, the Whigs were against the crown, against monarchy. So as the Americans were retreating, he did nothing. He did nothing about it. He could have further destroyed those American troops, but in fact, for the next couple of weeks, he would do nothing at all. And so, allowing the American forces, the rebel forces, to regroup. But Washington would be defeated a second time in New York City. And then there would be lots of desertions from him. He had barely 8,000 men. And at that point, that same British General Howe, he was moving very slowly, not following up on any opportunities that he had to finally crush the opposition. Had he actually taken those opportunities, England, in all likelihood, would have won the war. But his lack of action, his delay to respond, gave the rebel army the encouragement and then the ability to then go and finally win the war. But as I said earlier, I really don't want to get into all the details on all the battles. If that interests you, definitely buy the book, because it goes into a lot more detail. Just one other thing I want to point out here, though, is you have to remember King Louis XVI of France. He formally recognized the independence of the United States and signed a treaty with it. And it's ironic what would happen to him later on. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But, when you sign with rebels who are against monarchy, and this agreement or this treaty that King Louis XVI had signed was mainly due to Ben Franklin's untiring work of soliciting the support of France, and that was chiefly through Freemasonry, which would take that king's head off. France, in supporting the rebels, would be fighting against a perpetual enemy, England. But what they would gain from it would be not much. They would actually be probably the biggest losers, in that they got a few British islands, an increase in debt, and their troops that fought on the American side, if you remember, the Marquis de Lafayette was a key figure for the rebels. Those troops would go back with all of these liberal ideas that were already brewing in France as well. And then this would end up paving the way for the French Revolution, which would happen afterwards. So I think at this point I'm going to end this video here. And then we will get into the creation of the Constitution and then the other documents that come as a result of this rebellion against monarchy.